Do demons and other negative entities really exist? Is demonic oppression and possession real? And if so, what can we do to protect ourselves against it? The Anneliese Michel case was one of the most famous reported demonic possession and exorcism cases of all time. In the case, 2 Roman Catholic priests performed 67 exorcisms on Anneliese over a 10-month period. Ultimately, in 1976, Anneliese passed away due to malnutrition and dehydration, and some say as the result of an attempt to expel several demons from her. The case, which occurred in former Soviet-occupied East Germany, is fraught with controversy. The 2 priests and the parents involved were ultimately arrested and prosecuted for negligent homicide. There are plenty of documented cases of possession and exorcisms. Some may ask, where is the evidence to support the claims that so many supernatural acts have taken place during these exorcisms? Perhaps the evidence is tightly controlled by the Vatican. My guest, a writer named Michael Murchie, claims to have had many negative paranormal experiences as a child. Join Michael and I as we explore the dark side of the paranormal.
The opinions and views expressed by the guests of Passion for the Paranormal are not always the views and opinions expressed by the host.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome once again to Passion for the Paranormal. And I'm bringing my passion for the paranormal to you. I'm your host, Curry Stegan, and so great to be back with you once again. So my guest for this episode is Michael Murchie, and Michael is a writer, and he's written several articles about the paranormal, and he also had a lot of paranormal experiences as a kid, and I think he would probably describe those as negative experiences. And so he's going to be talking with me about the dark side of the paranormal and the things some call the demonic, whether it's demonic oppression or possession. We're going to be talking about those controversial subjects in the paranormal. And it's a topic I haven't covered before on the show, so I'm really looking forward to the getting into discussion with Michael. I really hope you enjoy tonight's show. If you haven't already, make sure you stop by and visit the Facebook page at facebook.com/passion, the number 4, the paranormal. Make sure you follow and like us there. Also stop by and visit the website, and that is at passion, the number 4, the paranormal.com. And there you can blog about past episodes. You can share your paranormal experiences, and you can catch up on past episodes there as well. So make sure you stop by and visit the website. If you know a friend you think that would like to tune in and check out the show, please share a link with them to the show, either iTunes or Google Play link, so they can check out the show and tune in. All right, so as I said before, my guest is Michael Murchie. It's going to be, I think, a great discussion, a very interesting one. It's a topic that, again, tends to be somewhat of a controversial topic, and one I've been wanting to explore for a while on the show. So buckle up, get ready, because I'm about getting to discussion with Michael. And once again, I really hope you enjoy tuning into tonight's show. Okay, so my guest today is Michael Murchie, and Michael is an expat Englishman who has relocated from the fast-paced, busy life of London to the more serene forests and lakes of Sweden. He is joining me via Skype from Sweden today, and his interest in the paranormal began at an early age, based on some personal experiences that continue to haunt him. And he's found it difficult to reach out to audiences where he can share his experiences, so Michael found Hub Pages, and this is a website that provides writers a platform to reach out and connect with like-minded people. And his articles on the paranormal have now reached over 1 million readers, some of whom have reached out to him for help and advice on how to deal with the negative side of the paranormal. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. We were talking just a minute ago, and I mentioned that, this is a topic I haven't covered before on the show. It's one that I have been wanting to cover. It is a show about all aspects of the paranormal. And so I think this is one that it's a controversial one. It is one that tends to bring out a lot of fear in people. And I think I mentioned to you, I've had some experience as a paranormal investigator and have never really had any experiences in the negative realm, I would say, thankfully. But can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned you've had some paranormal experiences. Can you talk a little bit about, the experiences you've had and how that's kind of impacted you?
Yeah, absolutely. My interest formed in the paranormal at a very early age. I was about 6 years old when the house we lived in just outside of Greater London, we started to experience at the beginning rather small instances of paranormal activity. Things like windows would be opened when they were closed previously, lights would turn on when they were off, and it started in a very small way. Unfortunately, it escalated rather rapidly over the course of about 12 months, and the haunting carried on from the age 6 to 13. So that's 7 years my family were pretty much tormented by what I can only describe as a negative entity. Now, this was witnessed by many people. My family called in the local priest on 2 occasions that I'm aware of in order to, first of all, bless the house, and on the second instance to actually perform a blessing on me because he felt there was an attachment there. This was evidenced by when my family sent me to a boarding school to remove me from the house. Things calmed down dramatically until I started discussing these things with an interested teacher at the school. And my mum had to ring the school and say, for the love of God, can you please stop him talking about this because all hell's breaking loose here. So despite the distance of maybe 7 or 8 miles, there still seemed to be that link to the house and whatever was in there. And in the end, we moved about 200 miles away in order to escape the house, the area, and things did settle down dramatically. But unfortunately, some things still linger, and it continues to this day.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds kind of frightening. Now, were you primarily the only person in the house affected, or were there other family members affected by the entity or the entities?
There were other people affected. My brother, my 2 sisters, they all had experiences. Brother-in-law, my parents, visitors to the house, and the priest involved as well. But their involvement was only as a side effect of my involvement. Whether you want to call it a negative entity, a negative spirit, an inhuman spirit, or even a poltergeist, because there are some crossovers and similarities there, it seemed to be drawing its strength from me. If I was ill, things would become exponentially worse in the house. If I had a fever, things would become worse. There was one instance where I was extremely ill with a fever, and when I was conscious, everything was fine and calm. And as soon as I lapsed into sleep or unconsciousness with the fever, then again, all hell broke loose in the house. My brother got locked in the kitchen. He couldn't get out despite the banging and crashing that was going on. We had a door which was vibrating at an absolutely ungodly rate. We tried to replicate that and couldn't find a way to actually move the door so fast that it would vibrate as it did. So it did seem to be very directly connected to me, but many family members and other people, friends and visitors, did experience things also.
Right. The thing I find fascinating about this topic, and even within the the paranormal realm, those who, whether they're paranormal investigators or have some sort of involvement in the metaphysical, the Fortean kind of topics that I deal with on this show, there's different viewpoints, and I find it interesting. Sometimes it happens to be based on perhaps religious and your background, the way you were raised, that sort of thing, the way people view this kind of topic. And so were you, your family, you and your family come from a background or a particular religious background?
No, that's one of the surprising things looking back at it. My parents weren't particularly religious. I was born out of wedlock. I wasn't baptized until I was 7 years old, a year after these events started happening. So I was raised to believe in God and to have a belief, but it certainly wasn't a strict Catholic upbringing, for example. It was very, very mild, you could say.
Now, you mentioned some of the experiences you were having, which sounded like they were pretty frightening. I can only imagine at that age having those kinds of experiences. What I wanted to ask was, because there can be different levels of activity, would you classify it as demonic? If you say negative, that may not be quite the threshold of demonic. And the priest, you said a priest was involved. Do you think this met the threshold of demonic type oppression, or was it maybe just more of just along the negative kind of experience?
That's a very, very difficult question to answer. I believe we were possibly on the verge of possession at that point. Like I said, there's a lot of crossover with poltergeist activity. You could look at the Enfield poltergeist case, for example. That one could be very easily read as a straightforward poltergeist case. You could also read that a very complex haunting, or you could look at it that there was an entity, a negative spirit, a demon, if you want to call it that was influencing everything. And in these cases, it is hard sometimes to identify exactly which area this fits into, because the demons lie, the devil lies. They try and cover their tracks until they are powerful enough to take control.
Yeah, it's again, this is a fascinating topic, and like I said, it can be controversial to some. There have been reports, let me back up just a minute here. Do you still have, you said you still have experiences to this day. Do you think it's related to the attachment you had when you were younger?
We do still have experiences, and I do believe they are related to it, because there are two things that happen repeatedly. Not on a regular basis necessarily, but at times of high stress or high emotion. The first of which, it's going to sound silly, but the sound of rushing water. That's something that we've heard in the last 3 or 4 houses that we've lived in, both in England and in Sweden now. In this house, we've had the priest come out to our house on one occasion. Also, another pattern is the sound of someone running up the stairs overhead. And it's difficult to explain the fear that you feel when you hear the same sound and the same pattern in the footsteps and the same timing as something that you heard possibly maybe 4 or 5 years ago in a different house in a different country. So there are links to what we experience that go back throughout to the original haunting. Whether or not it's the same thing, I'm not in a position to say, but the similarities are there.
Interesting. So the other question that I wanted to ask do you feel like there was something, and again, thank you for sharing. I know this is kind of a difficult subject, and again, this can be a very frightening topic for some. Do you think there was something that led to this attachment? Some people will say, people doing things that they may not understand may open themselves up to this, whether it be, pulling out a Ouija board and, doing something, in that realm. Was there anything that, as a child, that you may have done, you feel like may have opened yourself up to this?
In my case, no. There was no Ouija board. There was an interest in the paranormal, perhaps, as any kid at that age, and I've seen it with my daughters as well. When you're 6, 7, you're going through a development phase where you're starting to look for things that kind of scare you in a safe way. So you might read a book about a haunting, or nowadays watch a clip on YouTube about something slightly scary, knowing that you can turn it off. But certainly nothing that I would have gone looking for at that point. There was no Ouija board in the house. My parents weren't into the occult in any form at all. They were very, very working class, you could say. In fact, my dad vehemently denied anything ever happening, even when it happened in front of his face. He just could not even begin to comprehend that these things could be real.
And is that still true today for your father? Is he still fearful of this, or just unwilling to accept it?
He accepts what happens with an air of skepticism, we could say. He's he's getting on in years now, and I think the years have opened him up a bit to this sort of thing. He didn't have as much of the experiences as my mother and I, so maybe that played into it, but he did have his fair share, I have to say. But it was always with the typical sort of British stiff upper lip and plausible deniability.
Right, and I think that's the case for a lot of people. And I was always one that, I didn't have paranormal experiences when I was younger. I knew other people that had, and I kind of got into it as a skeptic. When I say a skeptic, that doesn't mean I was a non-believer. I was open to the idea, but really wanted to have an experience myself, because it's the old adage, I'll see it, I'll believe it when I see it or I experience it, and I did. And I've continued on in doing paranormal investigating, and so I understand the skeptic part of that, and I think that's healthy. They're now getting to the point where you're just not willing to accept things going on around you. That's probably a little bit different. But I wanted to talk about, because you wrote in a few of your articles, I think there was one about, or this may have been a separate article, I don't remember for sure, but there have been reports that demonic attachments are on the rise. And do you have any ideas about why you think this is occurring?
Well, there is definitely a trend with an increase in attachments. There are some interesting statistics that came out as reported in the UK, at least, by The Guardian, The Independent, and the BBC, all respected journalistic centres. According to a 2018 report, there was an interview on USA Today with Friar Benigno Palilla, who told Vatican Radio that there are currently approximately 500,000 cases in Italy alone that he believes need exorcism. Pentecostal churches are starting to increase in the UK. They're reporting a sharp rise in people reaching out for spiritual help regarding negative entities. So the stats are there to show that people are coming forwards with it. As for the whys, I have a few theories. I've heard that people blame things such as Harry Potterable things for this rise in demonic possession and attachment, which is clearly ludicrous. I mean, it's a film about magic and witchcraft, but it's just pure fantasy. However, we are so connected. It's scary times, people are divided across the whole world despite being connected in ways we've never been connected before. Church attendance is down. Belief is in decline in spirituality. We have increased commercialism. Laughably, a few months ago, there was a news article about Netflix being sued by the Church of Satan over the likeness of Baphomet being used in one of their programs. I mean, you just really can't make this up. Also, there's something called the Tulpa effect. I don't know if you've come across that. This is something I've been starting to research into. A tulpa, by definition, is a thought form or a being created from the collective thoughts of separate individuals. The concept is that the more you think about something and the more people think about something, it almost creates this psychic energy which can will it into existence. And there's research on this going back to the 60s and 70s. It's actually based on a very old idea from ancient religions. And there was an experiment called the Philip experiment where a group of people decided to try and manifest through seances a spirit which never really existed. So they created a backstory to him. They gathered together articles that he may have possessed in life if he ever did really exist. And they connected with him, allegedly. They opened a door, so to speak, to creating this purely by the thought of collective thinking. And that's terrifying. When you look at the state of the world today, Slender Man is a classic example that people are talking about at the moment. Now, obviously, he's just a creepypasta. So he's a creepypasta who has long reach at the moment, especially with the terrible attempted murder in America a few years ago. Who's to say that people dwelling on the negativity aren't creating the negativity themselves?
Right. And that's an interesting discussion, and that kind of brings me to my next question, and that is it's the idea that the kind of energy you bring, the kind of energy that you project, perhaps may result in the kind of energy that you attract. I mean, at least that's a theory out there, and if there's a lot of negative emotion and that sort of thing, there's this notion that you may be attracting that kind of energy towards you. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I do believe that. Over the Christmas period, I had a lady reach out to me as part of my articles. My email address is there for people to click and contact me. And over the past year, I have received dozens and dozens of emails from people personally requesting help. Not that there's much I can do other than offer advice, but the advice comes down to avoid negative people, avoid negative situations, surround yourself in light and positivity and positive people. These things can make a difference. These things can reverse the negativity that people find in their lives at the moment.
Right, and I tend to agree with that as well. I think there's this, power of the way we think and the things we attract in our life. So perhaps, if there's a lot of negative things going on in your life, maybe it's you may be opening yourself up to this sort of thing more. Can you talk about kind of the process, or not even the process, but some of the signs that you may see in someone if they have some sort of negative attachment, again, if you want to call it demonic or just negative, that sort of thing? What are some of the signs and early warning signs that people can watch out for and be aware of?
Yeah, these things tend to follow a pattern. The first pattern being manifestation and infestation, which can affect an area, a doll, typical Annabelle sort of situation. It's kind of a form of a powerful haunting, poltergeist activity. This is very important at this stage. If you feel that this is negative energy coming in, to start recording things, to start taking photographs, trying to get video evidence, absolutely vital for further research on this. In the early stage, it's almost as if the energy, the entity, the demon is seeking approval to come in, approval to stay. It needs attention. It starts off in small ways, but the more attention you feed it, and this goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago, the more attention you feed it, the more energy you feed it, and the more powerful they begin to become. You then move forwards to the oppression stage. This is where things become very dark, physical, mental attacks designed to break your will and to break your psyche down, to crush your faith in whatever you hold dear. Odd behavior in the people, things that you would never normally see that person do. Night terrors can be associated with this stage, which is a horrible, horrifying thing to experience. Negative reaction to prayer, different voices, different timings in the way they talk, different personality swings, and knowledge of things that perhaps they shouldn't or couldn't have knowledge of.
Here's another kind of twist to the the conversation or the argument, if you will. And again, it depends on who you're talking about and the way they view this topic. But from your vantage point and the kind of the research you've did in writing about this topic, are most of the people that have, this is going all the way to the threshold of people that have had exorcisms performed, have they primarily been people of faith, people of, a certain religious background who have had this experience? Because, some people, of course, the skeptics are going to say the power of suggestion, always comes into play here. So from your experience, has that been kind of the case for a lot of people affected by these kinds of attachments?
Certainly the more easily researched cases that I've come across do seem to have a background in religion. Yeah, I would have to agree with that. And of course, when investigating these things, you do have to be very mindful of the power of suggestion. It's certainly something that can influence how people feel these stages progress. That said, when you do reach the point where other people are witnessing these things, when the paranormal events start to take flight, that's when you have the opportunity to remove that influence, perhaps, and bring in people, perhaps such as yourself, who have experienced paranormal activity in other ways, to bring a different viewpoint in. While religion certainly does seem to be a factor in this case, I think it's very important to bring in people who perhaps aren't necessarily from the same religion as you or are agnostic, and that's the only way we're ever going to gather any evidence towards this, is to open up and bring in as many different viewpoints as possible.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree. Coming in with kind of more of an objective mindset as a paranormal investigator, I think, is important. And there have been times where people have claimed that there's demonic activity going on in their house, or there's certain types of activity going on in a certain spot in the house, and you find out there's really high EMF in a certain portion of the house that may be causing hallucinations, that they have very strong religious beliefs and backgrounds, and you can step into a situation and very easily. I hope, by the way, we don't lose the connection here, Mike. I am getting a signal here saying we have a poor connection. I hope, are you still there with me?
I'm still here, yeah.
Okay, good. And it went away, but I did get a little note pop up that said we have poor connection, but it's went away. So hopefully we'll be okay. But again, I think, is there a tendency for people to let their fears sometime get the best of them in this area and be quick to jump to that conclusion that something's negative or demonic?
Absolutely, because it is a terrifying subject, and with the proliferation of the information on the internet, it is very easy to jump to the wrong conclusions. And as a writer who deals with this sort of thing, I have to take my share of responsibility. Obviously, I've reached out to a lot of people, but the people that reach back to me, I try and handle on an individual basis, not to tear apart their thoughts or their theories, but rather to take the middle line and to say, well, I understand that this is what you're feeling and this is what your religion tells you, but maybe we can look at it from a different point of view.
Right, and as I was kind of reading up on this, it seems like if you go to, say, the Catholic Church, it sounds like they have a pretty strict, process they go through to determine whether or not, it even warrants doing an exorcism, per se. And so then you get into the mental illness aspect of it, and they have to carefully kind of follow that as well and kind of try and run down that part of it to make sure that somebody may not just be experiencing mental illness. So I can imagine that's a pretty
difficult process to try and go through. But can you talk to that a little bit? Because it seems like, somebody who may have schizophrenia, these sorts of things, how do they kind of narrow it down to determine whether it's mental illness or whether this is something beyond that?
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult situation. It is very difficult to identify whether it is mental illness or something darker. And mental illness is pretty dark in itself. There are, as you said, many crossovers: schizophrenia, multiple personality disorder, or dissociative disorder as it's called now, depression even. All of these things have crossovers into demonic possession, and it is incredibly difficult to identify which it is, especially given the fact that if you are in a case of possession, that depression could be a symptom of that in any case. And regarding this, I've only really been able to find information from the Catholic Church. As you said, they're very strict. Exorcism is an absolute last resort. And I have a quote here from a Father Vince Lampert, who's from the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. He says, an exorcist is trained to be a skeptic. The Church wants experts in the mental health field to weigh in, so the Church can make sure this is not just of a mental nature. The Church also requires the person to have a physical examination by a medical doctor. It's important to note the Church is not asking the mental health expert or the medical doctor if the person is possessed. The Church will make that determination itself. But they do need these experts in these areas to weigh in so that the Church can reach a level of moral certitude before proceeding with the ritual of exorcism. The Catholic Church is bringing in psychologists. They're bringing in medical doctors. They are doing everything they can to make sure that people aren't mentally sick before they go down a route which, in the case of a schizophrenic, you can only imagine the devastating damage that an exorcism could do to that person. It would be a terrifying, life-altering experience for them.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to back up for a minute because this goes back to the earlier discussion about that demonic attachments and reports of demonic activity are on the rise. Is this perhaps partly the result of social media and you mentioned the connectiveness of everybody now? We're doing this interview via Skype. Is it possible that just because of the fact that there's so much information out there now, that this may be part of the reason for the reports being on the rise?
It absolutely could be, yes. I mean, if you look at YouTube at the moment, just to take one example, a few years ago we had the Charlie experiment, which was supposedly talking to a demon by crossing pencils. Tens of millions of people saw that, went out, crossed two pencils, and tried to talk to a demon. The whole Zozo thing, that doesn't ring particularly true with me. That there's a lot of background to that doesn't seem legitimate, in my opinion. But again, hundreds of millions of people on YouTube are watching these videos and believing it. And again, that could perhaps link into the Tulpa effect. The more people having these negative thoughts could be creating this negativity going forwards.
Right. And, you see a lot, like you said, you see a lot of videos out there of paranormal nature that people are putting out there on YouTube. But, as you see some of these videos, you hear a lot of reports of, very supernatural events occurring during exorcisms. And I just find it interesting because you do see, videos out there where exorcisms are being performed, but, you really don't see this kind of thing being captured on film. And, there may be reasons for that. But what are some of the most incredible supernatural events that you've heard of occurring during an exorcism?
Yeah, I think I lost you for a second there. Are you with me?
Yeah, I'm here. I apologize. I'll ask the question again.
So
Okay, thank you.
yeah, so there's a lot of videos out there. You mentioned YouTube and stuff, and there are some videos out there on exorcisms being performed on people. But what you don't really see are the supernatural type events that are being claimed to occur during exorcisms. But I'm wondering what some of the most incredible supernatural events are that you've heard of occurring during exorcisms, and have you seen some of these?
Like you say, video evidence seems to be very much lacking. I'm not sure on the Catholic Church's policy of videoing these. I kind of would like to think that somewhere in the Vatican there's a huge videotape library filled with evidence that they're not quite ready to release to the public for fear of terrifying people. Obviously, there are other churches doing exorcisms. Their footage is a little easier to find. Their footage is a little less convincing when they lay on hands and the person falls down and starts convulsing on the floor. I don't really buy into that side of things at all. There's one case that I've just started looking into, which is reported by the Indianapolis Star back in 2014. And again, no good evidence has come out of it with regarding the exorcism. But people did witness a child crawl backwards up the wall before flipping over and landing on his feet. And things like that do come out, although they are incredibly rare. And of course, there's no video footage for that, but there is a signed document by the officials involved. I believe it was witnessed by a nurse. As far as other evidence goes, if you look at the Anneliese Michel case, the voices are terrifying. And again, looking back at the Enfield poltergeist case, the young girl involved in that was talking with a voice that could only be described as demonic. It almost sounds like several voices talking at the same time. I think if we're looking for evidence, at the moment, that's really as good as we're going to get. As far as other things happening, it is purely anecdotal at this stage. You hear about feats of strength, talking in a language that's unknown to the person, typically Latin, which isn't very often taught these days. It's a very difficult one. The evidence at the moment is not in our favor.
Right, and you mentioned a very famous case, the Anneliese Michel case, and I want to talk a little bit more about that case. Now, there is a lot. I've heard a few of the audios from that, and yeah, they are kind of terrifying. Was there actually a different language spoken in that? Was she speaking Latin or a different type of language in any of those audio clips captured?
I'm not sure about the audio clips. According to the book that I've read and the research I've done, she was heard by the priests to have spoken in 6 different languages, including Latin. Now, her family was devout Catholic, so it's possible she could have learnt Latin at some point, although the family said she hadn't. But 6 different languages, that's pretty impressive if the parents weren't aware of the fact that she could actually talk in those. As far as the rest of that case goes, it's obviously we have the time factor here. We're going back to an era where East Germany was under Soviet rule. Pretty much state atheism was the religion of choice. So to be Catholic at that point was a very unpopular thing. This girl, she endured 67 exorcisms over the course of several years. And even so, the case is extremely confusing.
Yeah, and I agree. It's very controversial on top of that. Now, as I understand it, and my recollection of the events of this case are probably a little bit muddy, but there were even weren't there criminal charges made against the priest, and was a family member also charged in this case?
Yeah, but at the end of it, when she sadly died, the parents and the two priests involved were prosecuted, and they were found guilty by a court of law, and prison time was served. But going back to the state atheism charge, there's a lot in this case that doesn't really add up. If we backtrack a little bit to her case beginning, we have the 6 different languages spoken. We have evidence of stigmata witnessed by a doctor. That's her displaying the wounds that Christ bore on the cross, both on her feet and her hands. She suffered from constant malnutrition. Despite gorging herself, she was still emaciated. She was down to 30 kilos. You'll have to bear with me. I'm not sure what that is in pounds for our American listeners. But she was absolutely tiny come the end, despite gorging. Now, she was diagnosed early on, before the thought of demonic influence was brought in. She was diagnosed with epilepsy by a doctor. This is pre-MRI days, so it's not like they could actually look inside her brain with an MRI scan and see the changes happening in real time. She was diagnosed, she was medicated. The medication didn't work. Now, this is the point where her religiosity could have come into play and started creating the fantasy of possession around her. However, the evidence that was not used in the court case and was deemed insignificant was that post-mortem examination showed her brain had suffered no damage whatsoever from her alleged epilepsy, which doesn't really hold true with what we know medically now. But that was deemed unimportant by the courts. They wanted a prosecution. They wanted people to have a line drawn underneath this so that they could go back to the state propaganda. It's a fascinating case, and for every answer you'd have to say, yes, it was demonic in nature, there's a counter-answer to no, it wasn't, and a further counter-answer to yes, it was. It's tremendously complicated.
Yeah, so I just did a quick Google search, so that's about 66 pounds. So that 30 kilograms is about 66 pounds. So that was actually the weight at the time she passed, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
It is a fascinating case, and there's so many facets to it. Now, did she exhibit some early signs of mental illness that was documented?
There was one doctor who claimed she did suffer from schizophrenia. So again, that could have been an issue. But was that you come into the cause and effect at that point, the chicken and the egg? Was the schizophrenia what caused her belief in the possession, along with her own deep-rooted beliefs and her family's beliefs? Or was possession causing the symptoms of schizophrenia?
Right, it's kind of the chicken before the egg kind of argument, and it's really one that it's probably pretty difficult to try and, come up with an answer on. And that's where it seems like these cases can be so difficult, and hence probably why the Catholic Church has such a rigorous process for ever getting to the point where they decide to do an exorcism. One, just for the sheer fact that they could be, setting themselves up. It's a huge liability for one. We've already talked about how, and there's been other cases where people have been, not just in the U.S. but across the world. I was just kind of doing some reading where family members have been charged because they were trying to. One was about a boy that had been physically abused and drowned as a result of the family thinking he was possessed, and family members were charged and convicted as a result of that one particular case. And there were other cases that were mentioned. And so, I can imagine that, there's a potential here for the possibility of mistaken identity, if you will, in a case where again, it goes back to the religious views of the family members and whatnot. Do you think there's times where they're just misreading the situation and it very well could be mental illness?
Yeah, that is a how should I put it? An increasingly worrying problem at this stage. That's why, to my mind, if people feel that they're having this problem, the best advice that we can give them is to seek psychiatric help first and foremost, to talk to their local priest, vicar, whatever, and discuss it. But you have to take the paranormal alongside any, how to put it, you have to take the paranormal alongside what this person is experiencing as well. It needs to be evidenced, it needs to be documented, it needs to be recorded in as scientific way as possible. If someone's suffering from schizophrenia, they can do a funny voice, they can throw themselves around perhaps, especially if that's their belief set. But if crosses on the wall start turning upside down, or doors and windows start crashing and opening on their own, then you've got something else that can be witnessed, can be recorded, can be logged, which backs up the fact that perhaps it isn't mental illness in this case, and perhaps there's something that the church does need to look into. And I think that's where the Catholic Church is coming from at the moment.
Right.
They certainly will not involve any form of exorcism until it's an absolute last resort, and they are very stringent on what they accept as proof for these instances.
Yeah, and that would certainly make sense. And you mentioned also if other people are experiencing these things, then and they're recording them, it certainly makes sense at that point that you could easily conclude that something more is going on here. Now this is kind of where now this goes back to the poltergeist argument. And for a while there, and it may still be a theory out there, is that poltergeists oftentimes center around young girls, adolescent girls, maybe that are experiencing some emotional trauma in their life, and that they can actually create this poltergeist. Now, I'm not necessarily a believer in that, but it is an interesting twist to the conversation that perhaps there's some sort of mental power created out of the situation where objects can be moved. Now, again, I'm not a believer necessarily in that argument, but it is one argument thrown out there for poltergeist cases.
Yeah, absolutely. But flip it again and imagine that this energy is real and that these adolescents are pouring out this emotional energy that they can't control and don't know what to do with and they've never experienced before in their lives. And now picture something that can feed off of that can use that to increase its own abilities, to cause chaos and sow terror in that household. And then it becomes like a vicious circle of increasing emotions and increasing energy. Meanwhile, this entity sits back and just laughs and enjoys the chaos it's sown and feeds the energy that's being thrown around by the devastated families.
Yeah, it certainly can. You can certainly see how they could grow and feed off of that kind of negative energy in that kind of scenario. What are some of the things that people can do early on? Things they can avoid, people like me, paranormal investigators, things that we can avoid doing to open ourselves up to this kind of thing?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with the word open. I mean, everyone has their little sort of good luck rituals. I'm sat here now surrounded by candles so that I'm sat in light while I'm talking about a very dark subject. That's something that I like to do to protect myself, whether it works or not. That's my faith, that's my belief. I think the most important thing, especially when you're investigating, you have to go in with an open mind. Don't be confrontational. I've seen some paranormal investigative programs where they go in and they call out the spirits and they hurl abuse and they swear at them. And you're just asking for trouble at that point. I think that's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. As far as what people themselves can do if they find themselves in a situation like this, these entities, they seem to thrive on chaos, as we said, and negative energy. That can lead to depression. That can lead to negative thoughts and negative actions. As we said before, surround yourself with light. Tidy up. It sounds condescending, but if something's thriving on chaos and disorder, don't give it that chaos. Do something that makes yourself feel better. Don't feed fuel to the fire. Just make the effort to brighten the place up. Clean, tidy, keep a diary of events and occurrences. Use a camcorder, mobile phone, anything. Record it, because people like us who investigate these things, we need this evidence, and it's sorely lacking in many cases. Also, as we said earlier, it's invaluable when you're presenting your case to a priest. If it goes to that point, they're going to need to see this. They're going to have to go up the chain. It's not going to be them that makes the decision on whether an exorcist or anything like that takes place. It's going to be the guys further up the chain. They need that evidence. As
Right.
far as things that could cause this, have you brought anything into the house recently? Have you bought something from an antique fair? Has the paranormal activity begun after you hung that creepy old photo on the wall that you got from the antique place? An old piano. I've heard tales of an old piano that was brought into a house which caused a haunting, which was very traumatic for the people. They removed the piano, they removed the haunting. You can carry out house cleansing yourself using candles, incense, bundles of sage, room to room. Bless each one. Don't miss a single room. And make sure to include the cellar, which is often forgotten. If you're a Catholic, obviously you have other weapons in your arsenal. You have the Holy Rosary. You can use that. You can recite that. And that might be enough to stop this thing dead in its tracks before it gathers its strength and before it becomes dangerous to everyone living there.
Yeah, you hit on a good point that I want to talk about too, and that's paranormal investigators sometimes get into the mode of provoking, and that's what I think you were talking to, and I've even been guilty of it before. I'm very, very cautious of doing that. There's only been a few occasions where I've really ever done that. For the most part, when I'm going into a location, I'm trying to make a genuine connection with whatever spirits may be there. And, some people say, well, this is anonymous with, doing seances and Ouija boards and trying to open up things. And to me, they are not the same thing. And the reason being is I'm trying to go in and collect evidence of what may already be there. I'm not trying to open it up and bring something in from elsewhere. I guess that's kind of the way I look at it. So I think you have to be careful. And again, you already alluded to this before. You have to be careful the way you're going in and the way you're handling the situation. If you're coming in with an attitude of mutual respect with whatever may be there, I think that energy is a lot better energy to bring in than to try and come in and challenge whatever's there and to try and, go in with kind of more of a disrespectful kind of attitude.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, a little prior knowledge of what you're engaging in before you go into that situation is invaluable. If you're going to a place which is a more typical residual haunting, then you can adapt your technique to go in and try and record and get evidence of that residual haunting. If going into a place where people have been scratched or bitten or pushed or shoved or had whispers in the ears, you're engaging with a more interactive force, whether that's poltergeist or a more active kind of haunting or a demonic entity. You're forewarned at that point. So if you're a religious person before you enter that sort of situation, a blessing wouldn't hurt. Even if you're not religious, a blessing wouldn't hurt at that point. There are things you can do to protect yourself as an investigator before you step foot through the threshold.
And, we touched on this a little bit with the Anneliese Michel case, but do you believe there have been other people that actually have died as a result of demonic possession?
I don't believe they've died as a result of the possession necessarily, more as a result of the exorcism. Exorcism is a terrifying and draining experience. Again, there's not a lot of information out there. I haven't been able to come up with anything concrete in my investigations. But in the case of Anneliese, I can honestly say in my thought process behind this is that the exorcism was necessary, but it was the exorcism that killed her. If you imagine 67 exorcisms over the course of a year and a half, how mentally, physically, and spiritually draining that is. It's damaging. And that's not to account for the people who go into exorcisms who perhaps need a psychiatrist instead. But I've not been able to find one corroborated piece of evidence that says someone has died as a result of a possession.
Interesting. So you did some research on a case, it's the story of the Curse of the Crying Boy painting. And there was a lot of information going out there, remember, on the internet for a while, but you seem to have kind of debunked this. Can you talk a little bit about that story and how you came to the conclusion you did on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember this back in the early 80s as a child, reading about it in the newspapers. It had legs, as they say. It was a story that would keep running and running and running. And the Crying Boy painting, there are a series of paintings, actually, mass-produced replicas from a Spanish artist, Bruno Armadio. Now, a fireman was reported to have removed an undamaged painting from the burnt-out wreck of a house in Yorkshire. This was the first one that I could pin down that started this whole curse thought process off. He was quoted as saying that no firefighter he knew would allow a copy of the painting in their house after this. Now, that the house is just wrecked, and this painting is undamaged. So firemen, perhaps a little superstitious. But over the coming months, there were more and more stories, all similar circumstances, with people's houses tragically catching fire and burning drastically to the ground, and the picture survived. So The Sun, one of our English newspapers, we could say with a propensity to the more extravagant headlines, decided that they could get all of these Crying Boy paintings together and burn them, just to try and hype up the newspaper sales, create mass hysteria. So that's what they did. Now, these houses, they all had the same circumstances. It was a house fire and an unburnt picture of the Crying Boy found in the wreckage. Now, a lot of them were different pictures. Like we said, it was a series of them. So the house fire that started it all, this was a chip pan fire. Now, back in the day, rather than having a deep fat electric fire, which was temperature controlled, a lot of people, especially working class people, would boil the oil on the stovetop and then put their French fries, chips, whatever, direct into the oil. Now, you've got no control over the temperature. There was a lot of chip pan fires at the time. The thing is, these pictures were predominantly in working class people's houses. So there were, it was the lower end of the housing scale. We're talking a lot of wiring problems. We're talking a lot of people who smoked inside the house. We're talking a lot of chip pans. All of these are what caused the fires, not the Crying Boy, as it turns out. The reasoning behind the painting surviving these fires, as it turns out, was really rather simple. They had a fireproof backing for the safety laws in Britain at the time. So what would happen, the fire would take hold through perfectly normal means of discarded cigarettes or whatever. The little string that was hanging the painting up would burn through and snap. The painting would fall to the floor, 9 times out of 10 falling face down. The painting was fireproof. The picture survived. But this was an absolute classic case of mass hysteria. This newspaper article, it sparked panic, absolute panic. I believe I'm right in saying they had 2,000 copies sent into them at one point to burn. And even a local fire chief, they tried to present him with a copy of the painting, and he refused it, despite knowing the official reasoning behind it. But again, if you go on YouTube now, they're presenting this particular story as absolute gospel fact. The Crying Boy painting, according to most YouTube commentators, is a cursed painting. This demonstrates why we have to be so careful with our investigations. It's a myth.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for sharing that story. And the reason why I wanted to point that out is, like you just said, we got to be very careful with this stuff. And Hollywood really plays on the fear of others, and that just seems to sell. You know, you've got paranormal shows out there that play on this. They play on the dark and the demonic aspect of this. And again, this is not to try and, delegitimize any of that, other than to say, I think there is you mentioned the mass hysteria that this case created. I think there's a tendency for that to happen because others out there are trying to get more page likes. They're trying to, and they know that people play on this kind of stuff. So I think you have to be very careful of that aspect of it, because again, I think Hollywood plays on it. You see a lot of the movies put out there, they'll say, well, that didn't really happen in that story, or, if you go back to the movie The Exorcism, well, that was based on, at least the guy that wrote the book on that was based on a boy that was supposedly possessed. But a lot of the supernatural things that were occurring in that movie were put in there for the sake of Hollywood, as far as what I've read about it. And there's a lot of that goes on, a lot of sensationalizing, if you will. So I think we all have to be careful of that. I think you put out some good information for people to be aware of if they feel like they have some sort of negative attachment, things they can do. Thank you so much for sharing that, because I think that's important for people to know. Try and document, try and get as much evidence you can, get help early, or as early as possible, those sorts of things. I don't know if there's anything you want to add on to that.
No, I think you've summed it all up very well there. The only thing I would say is I do get a lot of people contacting me on a daily basis. Long may it continue, because I hope that I can maybe soothe some troubled brows and, who knows, maybe spread a little light and help people through whatever they're experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those that, again, if you feel like you may be experiencing this sort of thing, just like Michael has mentioned, there's help out there. There's people you can talk to. If you're a person of faith, there's help you can get out there as well. So please make sure, if you believe you are being affected this way, please make sure you reach out and get that help. Michael, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show and talk with you about this subject. Again, it's a subject I haven't covered before. I think it's an interesting one, a fascinating one. Is there a place people can go to find more information about your writings and the work you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. If you go to www.hubpages.com @Zach Moonbeam, which is ZAKMOONBEAM, don't ask me where the name come from, then that will take you to my profile page. There's a contact the author, there's links to my articles that are on there, and that's the best way of getting in contact.
Great. Well, again, thank you for joining me on the show today, Michael. It was a pleasure to have you on, and maybe down the road again, we can have you back on and talk again.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
All right. Have a great day.
All right, so big thanks to Michael for joining me on the show to have a discussion about a topic that is interesting, but it's also very frightening.
And it's one that I've been wanting to cover on the show, like I said before, and so it was great to have him on to have that discussion. Make sure you don't miss the next episode when I'm going to have Rob Shelsky joining me. And Rob is the author of the book Shattered Reality, The Mandela Effect. Now, if you've heard about the Mandela Effect or you've read about it before, I'll just say it is a topic that I have kind of dismissed in the past. And I heard him talk on another radio show, and what a fascinating discussion it was. And he weaved in quantum physics and other kind of big brain topics in the discussion, and how they may relate to other paranormal phenomena. So it was quite an interesting discussion. It really reeled me in, and I was so glad to get him to come on the show to have the discussion with me about that topic. So make sure you don't miss that one. I think it's going to be a great one. And thanks again for tuning into the show. And have a great night, and we'll look forward to the next show.